In this lesson, you'll see how the multiple artboards that we set up in the template will automate the process of making the finished design into a finished product. If you're in Illustrator CS5, you have the added benefit of the Artboards panel, so you can double-click on any artboard name to fill the screen with that artboard. There's not an Artboards panel in CS4, but of course you can always use the hand tool and zoom shortcuts, or you can click an artboard to make it active and use the shortcut Command or Control 0 to make it fill the window. In Lesson 2, I showed you how to set these artboards up to start with, and one thing I'm always careful about when working with patterns especially is the measurements. We have to be sure that our measurements are exact and accurate, otherwise the repeat won't work. So it's very important that your artboards are the correct size and that they're positioned correctly, as I demonstrated in Lesson 2. If anything's off, even by the tiniest fraction, the export unit will not repeat properly when you send it to your fabric printer. And so if you ever need to troubleshoot a file, look at the size and position of your artboards first. But if everything's looking good, we're ready to print and export. To run a test of the repeating pattern on your home printer, choose Print or hit Command-Control-P. And your print dialog box may look different than mine depending on your system, but here we're primarily interested in specifying which artboard we want to print from. If all is checked here in the options, you can look at the print preview and cycle through what each artboard will look like when it's printed. I want to print a test so I can see how my pattern's looking across the field, so I'm going to print only artboard 3, the field artboard, and I'll just select Range and make sure it says number 3. You can also change the positioning by dragging the preview around, and you might want your test to show the top and left edges of the design to check for any missing elements if you're testing this pattern for a background paper. And the actual placement coordinates are reflected here. And right here you can choose to center the artboard or align it to one of its corners. You can hit Print to print this out, or hit Done if you need to go back to Illustrator while saving Artboard 3 and its print position in the Print Options dialog. And you can also adjust the print area while you're working inside the file by using the Print Tiling tool. It lives under the Hand tool, and you can position it right where you want it on your artboard. And then go back to the Print dialog, Command or Control-P, and the preview has updated. And your settings here will be saved when you hit Print or Done. Or you can change them. Say if I want to print out only my repeating unit, that's Artboard 2, the export unit. Then hit Tab to see the change to the print preview. And you may need to adjust the positioning in this window, which is like moving the print tiling guide right here in the dialog box. Then hit Done or Print, and these settings will remain for this file until you come back and change them. Back in the file, to hide the print tiling, go up to the View menu and choose Hide Print Tiling. Now to export. First, we'll export this file as a 12 by 12 inch background paper. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my field mask layer, and that way, if it somehow managed to get a little off register and it's not perfectly aligned with the field artboard, it won't leave a little white line on the edge of my final image file. So the mask layer is turned off. Then go to the File menu and choose Export. And then be sure to check the Use Artboards option. And in the Range box, choose which artboard to export. This time I'm going to choose 3, the field artboard, so I can make a background paper to use in Photoshop. Then I'll choose JPEG, hit Export, and then I can work with my quality settings in this dialog. I have my resolution set to high, or 300 dpi for good print resolution. And remember, if you're using any pixel-based effects in this art, like drop shadows, glows, and that sort of thing, and you want 300 ppi, you'll need to double check the document effects resolution settings, and that's in the Effect menu. And there you can change it to 300 if you haven't already done that. And remember, we originally set this template up to reflect the 150 ppi resolution that Spoonflower requires. Then hit OK, and you have a digital background paper that's ready for Photoshop or Elements. Finally, to export the repeating unit for upload to Spoonflower, choose File, Export again. Check Use Artboards, and this time specify Artboard 2, the export unit. And for Spoonflower, PNG is recommended. And on their site, they say that files uploaded there are automatically converted to PNGs anyway, so this should be the most compatible with their process. Then hit Export. The resolution should be 150 ppi. The background shouldn't be an issue because this tile has a solid color background already. And hit OK. And here's the finished unit. So we'll look at the process for uploading this to Spoonflower in another lesson. This particular pattern, the way I have it arranged here, this unit will work both as a grid repeat and as a half drop repeat. And what makes this pattern versatile like this is because there are no elements crossing the left and the right boundaries of this unit. And we'll look at the half drop repeat template in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the half drop repeat template. So to begin, open the file LC auto pattern _ half drop 4" for your version of Illustrator. You'll notice right away that the repeating field looks a little taller than it does in the basic template, but in the end we have the same components in this template. I'll zoom out a bit and turn off the artwork, the field mask, and the unit guides, and this way we can look at the artboards. Okay, so we still have 3 artboards here, but in a slightly different arrangement. I'll click on the Artboard tool to take us into Artboard mode, and you can see at the top we have the working unit. In this case, it's a 4x4" square. Now when you select Artboards here, you have to be really careful that you don't move anything. It's easy to do that by accident, and you can just move it slightly, so be aware of that. And you can always look up in the control bar and check the measurements. They should be nice round numbers. And I'll post the coordinates on the screen here in a minute so you'll have those. But because I'm in CS5, I can use the Artboards panel to select artboards without having to touch them in artboard mode where I might run the risk of moving them. So that's a good improvement made to CS5. Okay, so the second artboard here is the export unit. It's in a central position with the design all around its borders, and again that makes it a little more foolproof as an export for Spoonflower than the working unit would be. And because this is a half drop repeat, the first column is here. The next column of units is offset by half, so that's a 2" drop for this 4" square unit, and then so on. Okay, and then finally we have the 12x12" field artboard for printing and exporting backgrounds. And here are the measurements and coordinates for the artboards. For those who are in CS4, I've reset the ruler origin in the template files. So you'll notice 0 is in the top left corner in both directions. So you'll want to do that too if you're creating a new template from scratch. And we talk about this in my Illustrator Essentials classes. But basically you just drag a guide from the corner space between the rulers. Okay, so you can click on any other tool to leave artboard editing mode. And then back in the layers panel, I'll turn the art back on. So that's the background and the auto repeat layer. And then I'll turn the unit guides on too. And you can see we have more art than we need here, probably a little more than in the case of the basic repeat. And that's just a function of this half drop offset. And you can see at the bottom of the design, it sort of jumps up and down. So back in the layers panel, we have the field mask, and that helps you look at things trimmed at the edge. So really the 12x12 background artboard is down here, but we get a little extra design to preview and look at across the top. Okay, so first I'll go up to the View menu and turn off the artboard's visibility, just so we can focus on the unit guides and we can see our working unit here. And I'll zoom in a bit. And remember, you can change the guide color for a file in Preferences. So the layer structure in this file is the same as the basic repeat file. The one change, of course, is in the transform effects that are applied to the auto repeat layer. So let's look at that. Oh, and let me turn off this field mask. Okay, now I'll click the target on the auto repeat layer and go up to the appearance panel. And you'll see we have 3 transform effects now rather than the 2 that we did in the basic repeat file. And one more reminder about the preferences settings. If you're coming back to this lesson after a break, don't forget to go into preferences and uncheck scale, strokes, and effects, which will save you from scaling these effects accidentally, as I explained in an earlier lesson. Okay, so let's focus on the first effect. I'll turn the second and third off and click on the effect link. Okay, so here I have the horizontal move set to 8 inches. The vertical is set to 0, and the number of copies is 1. And it's obvious that's what's happening over here on the artboard. Instead of moving over 4 inches to the right like we did in the basic repeat, we skipped the half drop column and went 8 inches over with 1 copy. And I'm in CS5 here, and this measurement is the same for CS4. Now I'll turn visibility on for the second effect and click on the link to check out these measurements. And we see here we have 1 copy. Our horizontal move is 4 inches to the right, so that's establishing the second column of the design, the half drop. And the vertical is -2. So in CS5, this moves the copy up by 2 inches. If you're in CS4, your vertical move needs to be +2 inches. Okay, so now we have 1 row, and every other unit is offset vertically by half. And now we'll look at the third instance of the transform effect, which will take this whole row and copy it down to cover the rest of the field. So back in the appearance panel, in this last instance, the horizontal is set to 0, so no horizontal movement, just vertical, and vertical is moving by 4 inches in CS5. And in CS4, this number is a -4. And the number of copies is 4 to fill out the rest of the field. Okay, so that's how the half drop repeat template is set up. The ground rules are different for this type of repeat, of course, and this is more complex, so this template can really make life easier. But on a simple example, with just a single element like this, it's a little easier to see. If I place the element in the upper left corner of the unit, it crosses the unit boundary on the right side at exactly the same vertical axis, but rather than being directly opposite, it's now 2 inches down. So this is a 4-inch repeating unit, so that's a half drop, 2 inches. So anything on the left and right boundaries or in the corners is going to take on this drop from one side to the other. However, the top and bottom boundaries of the unit are identical, just like they are in a regular old basic or grid repeat. That's anything on the top and bottom that doesn't touch the corners. But of course, the beauty of this template is that it allows us to move and scale elements and work without having to think about that too much initially. However, it's good to know how the repeat works, because the more complex your pattern becomes, the more you have to worry about how things overlap. And so troubleshooting that is going to be more involved in a half drop than it is in a grid repeat. But you can use the editing tips that I gave earlier for managing overlap in Lesson 6. And for general editing, you can check out the tips in Lessons 4 and 5. Many of them will apply to this template as well, where we set up the keyboard increment and preferences so we could nudge objects around precisely. We worked with the scratch pad layer and the auto repeat layer back and forth while we're editing. And so there's more information to refresh your memory on in those lessons. Then, don't forget to check for missing art on the top and left sides of the field. You may need to move elements toward the top and left edges of the working unit as we did before. And in this template, it's really the left edge that you should pay attention to if you're going to be exporting or printing from the 12 by 12 inch artboard. In this template, there's already extra art along the top of the 12 by 12 artboard. So this top border should usually be covered, but the left border is the one you may need to double check. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at drawing lines and flourishes on your design that cross the borders of the repeating unit. If you want to create lines that travel across your pattern field like vine work, freehand stripes, or even never-ending roads and paths, these templates can really help. The drawing part is not that difficult with these templates once you know how they work. The challenge is in the fine-tuning you have to do to make it appear seamless in the repeat. So I'll grab the pencil tool and we'll give this a try. For this example, I'm using the 3-inch grid repeat. And under Preferences, Guides and Grid, I turned on the grid and I gave it a darker color than usual so we can see it better. And to make a custom color, just double click on the swatch here, and that works for either the guides or the grid. And if you don't like this grid, you can always draw your own guidelines. I show an example of that in Lesson 10. The point of the grid is to make it easy to see where your things enter the repeat unit on one side and leave on the opposite side. So when you're drawing with the pencil tool, it is hard to be precise, but you can sketch something out and then later go back and refine the ends of the lines where they meet the next tile. In a grid repeat, it doesn't matter how many loops you make in your line while you're working inside the repeat unit, as long as you cross the boundary in the same spot as you did on the opposite side. And you can always use the smooth tool to smooth your lines, and my ink and paint class talks more about adjusting fidelity and smoothness and the other options for the paintbrush, which works for the pencil tool as well. And then I talk about Wacom settings there too in that class. So once you have your line the way you want it, to edit your pencil lines to make the transition from one unit to the next, use the scissors tool and the white arrow to work with the curve handles. And this applies to lines that you draw with a pen as well. You have to adjust the curve handles at the very edge of the unit to make them appear as though they would flow and work with the repeating copy of your line. So that's where the fine-tuning comes in. And when you want to get a better look, you can go to the View menu to turn off the grid, but the shortcut is Command or Control quotation mark, so that's a little quicker. So it's good to spend some time experimenting with this with the pencil, where it's a little more straightforward and simple. If you want to apply an art brush to your path, you may need to do some more editing to make it appear seamless because so many brushes have tapered ends. Cutting the path with a brush applied just reapplies the brush to the new line segment, so you have to expand the art and edit from there. I like to work on a copy of my original line before expanding so I can edit the original path with the curve handles later if I need to. And expanding is best done on the scratch pad layer, so this is a good time to work back and forth between the repeat layer and the scratch pad layer, because if you expand something that's on the auto repeat layer, then all the copies get expanded too. So on the scratch pad layer, I'll make a copy and drag it down to the edge so I can see where the two would meet and figure out how I might make these two work together. And it looks like I'm going to need to add some thickness to the end of the path here. So I'm going to make a copy so I have an extra copy where I can borrow some of this textured line. And I'll change its color just to make it easier for me to see the copy and where it overlaps the original. And maybe I'll rotate it a little. Okay, and once I have it in place, I'm going to use the eraser tool, and the shortcut is Shift-E. And I can use the eraser tool to make some little edits like this, just to the edge here to keep it rough. And then also, I can use the eraser tool in a marquee fashion and just cut this line here with a nice and square cut. But first, you want to make sure that when you do this, you select the path that you want to erase, and that limits the eraser tool. And that way, I won't be erasing some of these other objects here that are unlocked. And to use this as a marquee, I just hold down the Option or Alt key and then just drag a little square, and there it is. Now I can go down and get the rest of this shape in the same way, just erasing it by dragging with Option or Alt. Now I'll zoom in and try to do a little cleanup work here. Can always hit undo if there's something I don't like. Then I'll change the color back to white so it's a little easier to work with. And you can use your white arrow tool to get to the points and paths and make some more edits. And then I'll turn off the unit guides for a moment so I can see whether this is looking seamless enough. Now I'll delete the shape that I don't need. This was just sort of a guide. And then using the shape builder tool, that's Shift M, or you could use the Pathfinder for this. I can merge. And now with my new line selected, I can drag it down to the auto repeat layer, turn that on and zoom out a little bit, and in repeat, it looks pretty good. If you're drawing on the half drop template, your paths that cross the top and bottom boundaries follow the same rules as they do on the grid repeat. It's the left and right boundaries that are different in a half drop. Anything that crosses on the left will be offset on the right edge by half the height of the repeat unit. To illustrate this, I placed a rectangle in the working unit. It's locked and it's on a separate layer, so I won't accidentally move it, but it's 4 inches wide, same as the repeating unit, and 2 inches high, which is half the height of the unit. I can follow this guide to draw lines from one edge to the other that will match up in repeat. From there, it's a matter of editing the ends of the path, like we just did, to make it appear as if it flows seamlessly from one unit to the next. And then you can always unlock and move this rectangular guide to draw other paths if you need to. You can get a lot of use out of the included templates for this class, and then when you need a different size for a particular project, you can modify the templates by changing the artboard sizes and the transform effects just by following what I did in the first few lessons for the basic repeat. And here I'm going to demonstrate changing the unit size using the half drop repeat. And I'll move quickly here so we can look at some other tips at the end of this lesson. Say I want to create a half drop template with a 7-inch square repeat unit. I'll start with my 4-inch half drop template, and I've pared down the pattern, just moving elements to the scratch pad layer, and I've left only one element in the auto repeat layer just to keep things uncluttered as I work. And then in the layers panel, turn off all the layers so we have a clear view of the artboards, and you can turn artboard visibility on in the view menu if they aren't showing. Then in artboard mode, select the working unit, that's artboard 1, and I can leave X and Y the same as I did before, and that's for CS5 and CS6, and our reference point is in the upper left corner. And then I'll change the size of the artboard to 7 and 7 inches. And for CS4 users, remember artboards are aligned only from the center point in CS4, so your X and Y numbers here will be different, and you'll need to figure the coordinates out based on the size of the unit you're creating for. So for example, with this 7-inch square, your X and Y would be 3.5 inches and negative 3.5 inches. Okay, and then moving on to the export unit, the width and height, again, are 7 and 7 inches. And in CS5, the X and Y is 7 inches and 10.5 inches. So I arrived at 10.5 inches for the Y value because that's the height of the unit plus half the height. So that's for the offset. If you didn't add the extra 3.5 inches here for offset and just left the Y at 7 inches, your export unit could still work. It will just look different from the working unit. So I do this to keep them consistent. And then for the field artboard, we'll leave it at 12 inches square, and the X coordinate stays the same. That's in CS5 and CS6, that's 0. And then the Y coordinate is the same as the height of the working unit, 7 inches, in CS5 and CS6. But In CS4, it's 7 plus 6. That's half the field artboard, so that's a negative 13 inches. Now I'll hit Escape to leave artboard mode and go and turn on the background and the auto repeat layer, and I want to make sure that the background is unlocked. And you'll see now that I have to adjust the size of my background, so I'll stretch it down to cover the bottom of the field artboard. And you can see the export unit is sticking out from the field artboard, so I'm going to stretch my background out here to cover this. And while I'm at it, I'll keep going, so I'm adding approximately 7 more inches here on the right side. So when the design repeats out, it will have enough background for previewing. Now you could make the field artboard here larger than 12 by 12 if you need it for exporting or making an extra large print. That's up to you. But the more repeating that the transform effects have to do, the more processing power that's required from your computer. So it just depends on your system and the art you're working with, whether or not it makes sense to make this repeat area bigger. Okay, and now we'll edit the transform effects on the auto repeat layer. So click the target in the Layers panel, and for the first effect, check Preview, and the horizontal is double the unit size, so that's 14 inches. And there's no vertical movement here, so we'll leave that as is, and then just one copy. Hit OK. The next effect establishes the offset column, so check Preview, and horizontal is the width of the unit, that's 7 here. And vertical makes up the half and half drop, so that's a negative 3.5 inches. So that second column moves up. That's why we use a negative number in CS5. And I know it's called a half drop, but this just happens to fill out the space better when we start higher up. And then in CS4, this is a positive 3.5 inches. And again, it's one copy, and then hit OK. For the final effect, check Preview, and 4 copies here is overkill. I'll change that to 3. And then horizontal movement is 0. Vertical is the same as the height of the repeat unit, so that's 7. And in CS4, negative 7. And then hit OK. And let's back out and take a look. So far, it's looking good, and you can play around with this one element and copy it and scale it and just play around with the design, and that'll help you make sure that it's working okay. Next, you'll need to go in and resize the field mask and the unit guides because those won't match up now, but that's pretty self-explanatory, so I'll leave that to you. What I really want to show you are some ideas for extending the functionality of these templates. So I'll jump back to the 4-inch half drop, and I've got another design here I'm working on. And one thing I find really useful is working with multiple auto repeat layers. For example, I copied the auto repeat layer, and you can copy a layer by dragging it down to the new layer icon. So I'll turn my new layer on, and you can see I drew a grid on it. There's a line at every inch, and this helps me to work on my spacing as I'm figuring out the design. And of course, this new grid layer has those transform effects on it too, so you can see in outline mode, I only had to draw one grid, and it repeats throughout my design automatically. Then I dialed back the transparency of the grid lines to make it more subtle. And then back in the Layers panel, it's easy to turn it off and on as I work. So you can use something like this for spacing or for drawing, sort of like we looked at in Lesson 9. So it's a big help having this separate layer. You could also use another auto repeat layer for a background design too. So for this, I'll just get the grid layer and drag it down to the new layer icon, and that makes a copy of it directly on top of the original grid layer. And I'll turn off and lock the original grid layer so I can keep that undisturbed. And while I'm at it, I'm going to lock and hide the layer with the repeating design. Then I'll select the new layer, and over in my artboard, I'll select and delete the grid line since I don't need the copy of the lines, but the transform effects are still here. They're still attached to this layer, and that's what I want. And here I can draw some polka dots, and I'll make them transparent. But here, you could do a texture or something more intricate, like some vine work in the background. And then once I've worked on this for a bit, I can turn the foreground design back on, and then I just play with the dots, distributing the rest of the design, and this is a great help. And really, as much as I like the new pattern maker in version CS6, it takes you out of the realm of layers, and that can be a limitation if you're used to working in Illustrator and used to having the benefit of layers that you can lock and turn off and on. And so I really like using layers to sort of separate and organize things. It's a big part of designing in Illustrator. So you could conceivably use this template for parts of the process in CS6 and then use the pattern maker for other parts of the process and have the best of both worlds. Okay, so that's copying these auto repeat layers. And of course, you could do the same with the scratch pad layer if you need to organize your non-repeating elements. Another thing you can do is make your field mask transparent. You can just unlock the field mask layer, target the layer, go to the transparency panel, and reduce the opacity. So the opacity setting applies to the entire layer. Then I'll go back to the layers panel and lock the field mask again. And now I can select and move these elements that fall outside the trim area. So that's another modification you can do to make your templates more usable if you like. You can even create more artboards for different exports or create a separate artboard where you can keep scratch pad elements. And so if you're in CS5 or CF6, you have the Artboards panel, which enables you to double click on the name of an artboard and that will just center it right up in your window. So that's yet another way to customize the templates. And I'm sure you'll come up with more creative modifications too. All right, and now we're ready to talk about exporting your designs to Spoonflower. Two things that are very important for working with Spoonflower or any automated printer online are: one, to double and triple check your measurements just to head off any potential problems in the repeat. And two, check colors against a physical example of printed colors on fabric, so you're designing with realistic color expectations rather than just relying on what you see on screen. Your computer screen is an unreliable representation of printed color. Spoonflower provides two options for color checking: the color guide, which is a small sample, and the color map, a much larger sample. You can find instructions and tips for working with color in detail on the Spoonflower site. The Spoonflower color guide is a small swatch that you can order from their site for $1, and it has 171 colors printed on it with hex codes for each color. Hex codes are 6 digits made up of numbers and letters, and they're commonly used in web design to identify specific colors. Now, the colors are still RGB colors, and we're still working in the RGB space. The hex code is just a more efficient system for identifying colors here. If you look at some of the included swatches in the template files for this class, you can look in the color panel at the swatch, and the swatch is named with the hex code. And I made these into global swatches myself. That's why the swatch has a white triangle in the corner. It's a global swatch. And that also gives you a tint slider up in the color panel for this color. And global swatches make it easy to make adjustments to colors across your file. So I always work with global swatches in Illustrator. So in the color panel, if I double click on the color to get the color picker, you can see the hex code is down here. I can enter a code from the physical sample right here and hit tab and see the screen version of that color appear and the RGB values here. Now I can save this in my swatches panel and make it into a global swatch. So the color guide is a good place to start. So that's the color guide, but you may want more than 171 colors. So for that, you need to order the color map. There are nearly 1,500 colors printed on the color map, and the hex codes are there, and you can select the fabric you want the map printed on as well. Spoonflower also provides a corresponding color library in ASE format. That's Adobe Swatch Exchange. You can download the .ase file from the Spoonflower website and then place it in a folder on your system to have access to it inside the Illustrator Color Swatch library. The directory path differs for Mac and PC depending on your system, and here it is. Once you have the ASE file in the right folder, you can go to the Library button on the Swatches panel and open the Spoonflower Color Map library. Choose the option to Show Find field, and you can type hex codes from the fabric color map to locate the swatch in the library. Then drag a swatch to add it to your swatches panel. Then double-click it and check Global to make it a global swatch. In Lesson 7, we went through the steps for preparing and exporting a single unit as a PNG that we can upload to Spoonflower. So review Lesson 7 for those steps. And again, it's very important before you export to double-check the measurements in your file. The size and position of the artboards is crucial because if something's off, even by a tiny amount, your design will not repeat seamlessly. And now you know how to check your colors, so once you've done these two things, you should have a PNG file at 150 ppi that's exported and ready for the next step. On Spoonflower's site, you'll need to set up an account if you don't have one already, and to upload a design you can go to the Create tab and click Choose File to choose the PNG from your system. And Illustrator automatically appends the file name with the artboard name, so in CS5 and 6, the file name will have Export Unit in the title. In CS4, it will have the number 2 in the title. Once you've chosen, click the Upload button, and on the next screen, choose the Layout option. By default, it's a basic repeat, but if you're using the half-drop template, choose half-drop. And then your design should look right in the preview. Then select the size of the swatch or yardage that you want to order. I highly recommend ordering an 8x8 inch test swatch first, just to make sure those colors are right, and to make sure the repeat looks good. As they say, measure twice, cut once. But before ordering a test, make use of Spoonflower's system here and just preview some of these different sizes to check for errors in your repeat. Sometimes it's easier to see everything on a fat quarter. That's a quarter of yardage. And then check out the 1 yard option with the full 42 inch width, and even go to 2 yards. And then I'll go back to the test swatch size now, so that's 8x8 inches, and I can choose the fabric I want my test printed on up here. And then in the preview window, I can see where the seam issues would be between the tiling units in this area of my 4x4 unit, and it looks okay. You can also click this link here to change the size of your repeat unit and make it smaller. And since we have a 150 ppi PNG, we don't have enough resolution to make it bigger than the original 4x4 inches, but smaller is okay. And I would probably make this edit myself back in Illustrator, but it's a nice feature just for doing a quick preview of a different scale right here on their site. Just make sure you go back to the original scale if that's what you want, and mine here is 4x4 inches. Below the preview there are other options, and here you have the option to keep your design private or offer it for sale. Okay, and now it's important to click Save This View. So next time you look at this half-drop design in your library, it'll appear as a half-drop and not the default basic repeat. And it asks me if I want to make this the default view, and I'll hit OK. Now I can go to my design library for my account and see all my designs, and I can rename them here, organize them into collections, etc.